Ben Wong, Executive Director of Wong School. Born and raised in San Francisco native, mostly originally actually in the Chinatown North Beach area, but as my brother got into law, and in the early 70s we were part of that wave of Chinese American families who came to the Sunset. My parents bought a house out here on 31st and Judah, and so we moved at that time. And so my middle school and high school years and much of my adult has been on the west side of San Francisco. But this was early 70s. We were probably one of the first wave, quite frankly, of Chinese American families who found the Sunset to be affordable. I was a kid, but will tell you that when I came to the Sunset, well, first of all, I didn't even know Sunset existed. I grew up in Chinatown and North Beach. Felt very far away. But clearly, I had this conversation with my brother many years ago. It was sort of that move that we felt like we moved to the middle class. It was less dense. It had a wider neighborhood. It had parks. It had libraries. It had just things that were more sort of spread out. So it very much felt like we moved to the middle class. And I've only discovered later that that's exactly what it was, is that Sunset was very much more middle class, much more affordable housing, good schools, those kinds of things. I didn't know that at the time. But had lived then in the Sunset all through my middle school, high school, college years. You don't have to put this in the video, but truth be known, we used a fake address because this was also during busing. And so I went to an elementary school closer back to North Beach, Chinatown, but not using the address out here to do so. Like all of those was just part of my history and experience and background of the times, basically. I currently live in the Richmond district, so still on the west side. So other than my early years in Chinatown, North Beach, but for the most part have been now in the west side. I've been executive director here at Wong School for the last 7 years, and so it's definitely a reacquaintance, familiarity of being back here in the Sunset. So. Well, we were, I have to say, fortunate again to get in early in the early 70s. My parents bought the house, it's going to blow you away, bought the house, it's a regular Sunset house for $32,000, basically. And in fact, I remember very distinctly that my uncle, who moved in across the street about a year and a half later, paid significantly more. So we were just, again, part of that first wave of families moving up to the Sunset. My dad had owned that house probably until a good 35 years, and when he sold it, it was like close to $1 million. And so, again, my dad was a blue-collar immigrant, didn't speak the language, and so imagine that he could go from like a dense neighborhood of Chinatown, North Beach, to owning a house that's worth $1 million is pretty significantly incredible when you think about it. It was really that timing of what we consider the real American story. Could we buy a house today at $1 million? No. He was blue collar. My mom worked for the government, so not really like professional level type professions, basically. We were probably in the same situation where I think a lot of families are, which is what they consider asset rich, cash poor, which is don't make enough income really to buy that house, but you're there because that's what the previous generation had invested in. So that's what I think happens a lot here in the Sunset. I probably would say less about the kids who come to this school in that regard, although it does exist. I will tell you, I worked with young people. My professional background basically is child and youth development. And so done work in Chinatown, done work in different parts of the city. And clearly most all the young people that I know can't afford to live in San Francisco. So the vast majority of them who now are in their 30s and 40s live outside of San Francisco. They still have affiliations to San Francisco, right? They still come here for the restaurants. This is where they meet socially, all those things. And a lot of their friends are still in San Francisco. But the vast majority of them really do live outside of San Francisco. I think that's where I see the greatest impact is these people who are born and raised here can't really afford to stay here. My own niece and nephews live in Oakland, and they were born and raised in San Francisco. They would love to be here in San Francisco. They just can't afford it. And so my niece actually, her and her partner basically are nonprofit workers. And so that's, I think, another population. So teachers and nonprofit workers, right, really just can't afford to live here. So the vast majority of them will say San Francisco has changed. Some of it is because of the density, some of it is traffic, some of it is crime. The main reason I think people really will cite is really just affordability. And then when you make a comparison between what you can get here, what you can get in other places in the Bay Area, they feel like, well, dollar for dollar might make more sense to go outside of San Francisco. I'll say that I think there's also like a level of comfortability to go outside San Francisco because there's still roots here in San Francisco. So many of us are still here, and so they feel like either they can still come back to visit or those kinds of things. I have to say though, nowadays we spend more time going out to Oakland than people coming back into San Francisco. So. I'm guessing it's two. This is just sort of anecdotal, right? Those who I think are immigrant, isolated, may not speak the language, have housing barriers, mostly because of income and language. And then I think young people who in two ways, which is that if they choose and want to choose to live in San Francisco, just can't afford it. And so that includes a lot of your young families, the people who are just partnering, coupling up and having children. Many of them are actually living outside of San Francisco. You have to be in what we would consider the San Francisco middle class, which is pretty high level professions. So architects, lawyers, those are the San Francisco middle class, not the nurses and the teachers that really, really need to be here. And so that's where I think there's a huge impact. So I think part of our work at WAME really is to focus and remember our target audience really is those nurses and teachers. Well, I think one of the challenges I think San Francisco has had is it has built housing. It doesn't mean it hasn't built housing. I think the problem it has is built high-rise market rate housing, and mostly on the east side of San Francisco. And so then there's a real, from my perspective, I think that's been a failed policy, to be honest with you. I just don't think it's been equitable. I don't think it makes any sense, to be honest with you. I think the idea that housing is by nature trickle down doesn't work in the same way that other economic parameters might have, right? And so I think there needs to be an effort around specifically housing affordability at all levels. And it doesn't necessarily mean that you wouldn't build market rate housing, but clearly there's a focus that needs to happen for middle income, lower income families, because what has happened in the last 20 years around market rate housing has not been all that effective, I think. I think it's policy, but I think it's policy that has to be driven by our values. And so the very idea that much of who came into San Francisco was a lot of the startups, a lot of the social media, a lot of the people who actually have access already, and while ignoring sort of like how those sort of people get served. And this is sort of like that class question, I think, around it's not a sustainable economic model, and so I think it just has to be served at all levels. I don't have a policy prescription. I'm not smart enough to have a policy prescription in that regard. I do think though that there has to be a values-driven kind of question though. I'm not opposed to economic vitality, but it has to be economic vitality at all levels. And I think that's what gets missed. And I think we tend to look at the top and think everything trickles down. And I think time and time and again, it's shown that actually it's not true. And so you also think about it in terms of minimum wage, you think about it in terms of rent control laws, right? It's sort of like it has to have a balance. And so. Yeah, this is going to get controversial, but I do want to see more housing available in the West Side. The map that I saw from San Francisco Planning Department around where the housing has been built and where it hasn't is phenomenally stark and really unacceptable for a city policy, right? For approach that says we deserve and respect all income levels and all people resident in San Francisco. It's unconscionable, to be honest with you. And so. So this idea that we're going to build more density, more affordable housing, more housing affordability on the West Side, I actually support. I actually think it's the right move. I think it's a move that we've delayed way too long. And part of the issue and challenge right now with the West Side is unfamiliarity with density, unfamiliarity with new housing, unfamiliarity with housing affordability, and unfamiliarity with affordable housing, what it is and what it's not. And so that's part of the work that I think we're doing here at Wame, is trying to help support residents' neighborhood. The character of the neighborhood can remain, but really it's the idea that we want more people here because we love this neighborhood and community so much. And so housing density is not going to change that, it's going to support it. So probably the merchant corridors, Sunset, Richmond also really is really well blessed with a lot of the individual small merchants, basically. The merchant corridors of Irving, Judah, Noriega, and Taraval really builds a character of a neighborhood, right? And so those are the kinds of things that I think people want to see maintained. I also think that we can do better in terms of transportation. So Sunset is geographically quite large, and so there are buses and sort of the streetcars out here, but it could be kind of a walk. And people don't quite realize that because it's Sunset. It's one neighborhood. Everyone thinks it's one neighborhood. Actually, there's a lot of smaller neighborhoods within the district itself that people don't quite realize. And so I think the character of those merchant corridors are really, really important. Well, I'll say this, which is I grew up in Sunset. There's not enough. In fact, there aren't any child, teen, youth centers out here. People don't know this, but Sunset, according to the state, is a high priority for childcare. People wouldn't think that, mostly because a lot of the childcare out here is home-based, but Wame is one of the few center-based programs out here in the Sunset. So I would like to see more of those type of services, everything from immigrant services, legal services, those kinds of things that are needed out here. Many of the people actually here in the Sunset go to Chinatown for their services, whereas we could be doing that out here on the west side. So not so much that what I would take a benefit of, because I think that I have accessibility. I have a car, I'm educated, I can move around. I do think that immigrant populations, I think seniors, I think isolated seniors, I think there's just a number of, I think young families really could use a lot more support out here. So of course I speak for Wame School, which does bilingual education. So clearly one of the things we've actually been working with the city on is ensuring that as we talk about housing, we talk about all the neighborhood services that has to go with it, right? And that includes childcare, after-school programs, leadership programs, teen centers, those kinds of places. And so that's the kind of service work that we'd like to see go hand in hand with housing. If you talk about neighborhoods, I think it is ensuring that people have access to the kind of services they need on a regular basis. So for seniors, it's access to pharmacies. It is open spaces for people to walk. It is libraries for people to borrow and rent, do the kinds of things they need to do. It is the connectedness that people have, that they feel a part of that neighborhood, that they feel like they have a stake in that neighborhood. Again, there is elements of that out here on the west side, but because it's geographically large, I think there is a potential sense of disconnectedness. I also think, I mentioned the three major corridors, which is Irving, Noriega, Taraval. If you live on Tara and 30, whatever it is, you're using a car, there's a hill. I don't think that actually people even know that there's hills in the Sunset District, because it's a grid, it's a straight grid, unlike some other neighborhoods, right? It's a straight grid, so you think it's an easy shot. It can be kind of a challenge sometimes to get from a particular place to one of the major corridors. So more access to that kind of transportation, better bike lanes maybe, those kinds of things. I don't think we can flatten the hill, but certainly, ways of actually having sort of easier access. As I get older, it is one of the things that I think about is well, if I live on a hill, how's this gonna work, right? How do you really get mobility, quite frankly, to the things you need, So I've said this. So I grew up in North Beach. A lot of my work was in Chinatown and North Beach. Very dense neighborhood. Lots of issues and challenges. It is a very vibrant neighborhood. A ton of community services to support immigrant families there. But I tell people this: when they move into San Francisco, people tend to move into the high talked about areas, the Hayes Valley, the Mission. I says, when you're really ready to move into San Francisco, you move into the Richmond or the Sunset because you've now settled in. And so there is a thing about sort of the Richmond and Sunset. In fact, I just had this conversation yesterday with somebody around the restaurants. And so I said, you know, Richmond and Sunset isn't necessarily destination neighborhoods, but there's some really great eats out here. I think that's the best way to think about it, which is people might not be driving to the Sunset to go to a restaurant, but boy, once you're here, you know, it's sort of a, I wouldn't say a hidden gem, but certainly there's a lot to be proud about sort of the neighborhood. And I think that's how I think about the Richmond and Sunset, which is when you're really ready to settle in, it's going to be the Richmond and Sunset, mostly because it has sort of that balance of the things you're looking for, right? Grocery stores and good restaurants and some of the good bars, you know, those kinds of things, but not necessarily the hype or the hustle and bustle of other parts of the city. Again, I'll start with overthrow of capitalism. But aside from that, certainly I think a place where people who are born and raised in San Francisco can feel like it's still their city. I'm not entirely sure. I think there's elements of that I think about how it got lost. But I don't know if anybody has a firm handle on that and what that even means, quite frankly. Now I say that because I'm a San Francisco native, right? And so it's one of those where it's kind of sad that people who are born and raised here doesn't feel like that they can be here. And in fact, really can say, I think, I don't know if they even feel like it's their city anymore. And so that's something that's just odd to me, being a San Francisco native. So I would like to capture some of that back, and some of that is tied to affordability and housing affordability. And I think we can manage some of the other questions of density and parking and traffic and those kinds of things. I think many of us are sort of accustomed to that. But if you can't afford to be there, then it's almost like it's not worth the fight. And so I think housing is such a critical part of that. I trust San Franciscans enough to know that we'll figure out the neighborhood services as the housing gets built. There's enough advocates out here, there's enough community members, there's enough strong voices to make sure that happens. But I think it's tied again just to the quality of life that we're looking for and looking at. We live in an amazing city. Like, I'm really, really proud to be a San Franciscan, I really am. And so I want to continue to maintain that level of hope for San Francisco. But the policies do have to change in order for that to